Hey, my name's Tom, I'm 35, and I work as a graphic designer in Seattle. I've always been a pretty laid-back, easygoing guy focused on my career, enjoying the simple things in life. Or at least, that's how it used to be before everything went sideways that I met my wife, Rachel, about 9 years ago at a coffee shop downtown. I was sketching out ideas for a project, and she sat down at the table next to me with this huge, loud group of friends. I remember being annoyed at first because they were so loud, but then she made a joke that made me laugh, and that was it. She had this energy about her, funny, confident, the kind of person who lights up a room without even trying. We started talking that day, and by the end of the week, we were inseparable. Rachel had this magnetic personality. She could make friends anywhere, from the barista at our favorite coffee shop to strangers on the street. I'm more of an introvert, so her extroverted charm balanced me out. We dated for about 3 years before tying the knot. Our relationship felt solid, like we were this unstoppable team. Rachel worked in event planning, so she was always busy, but we made time for each other. We traveled, bought a house together in a quiet neighborhood, and even started talking about having kids. Everything seemed perfect, until it wasn't. About a year ago, I started noticing little changes. Rachel became more distant, more irritable over small things that never used to bother her. She'd brush me off when I tried to talk about her day, claiming she was just exhausted from work. At first, I believed her. Event planning can be brutal, and I wanted to be supportive. But then she started working late more often, way more often. When she was home, she was glued to her phone, constantly texting someone and quickly locking her screen when I walked by. It wasn't like her. Then there were the weekend work trips. Rachel never used to work weekends unless it was for a big event, and even then, she'd tell me all about it. But suddenly, she had these vague trips out of town, claiming last-minute emergencies with clients. She'd leave Friday afternoon and come back late Sunday night, acting like nothing was out of the ordinary. I wanted to believe her, but the gut feeling that something was wrong just wouldn't go away, and as much as I wanted to believe it was all in my head, the truth was about to hit me harder than I could have ever imagined. It all came to a head one random Tuesday, the kind of day that starts off so normal you'd never expect it to spiral into chaos. Rachel had left for another late meeting with a client, and I was home alone, trying to distract myself with a movie I'd seen a dozen times before. Halfway through, just as I was starting to convince myself I was being paranoid, there was a knock at the door. It was odd. We don't usually get visitors that late, and I wasn't expecting anyone. When I opened the door, there was no one there, just an envelope sitting on the doormat. No name, no return address, just Tom, scrawled across the front in messy handwriting. My heart was already pounding, but I tried to shake it off. Maybe it's a prank, I told myself. Or some weird neighbor thing. But deep down, I knew. I knew before I even picked it up that whatever was inside was going to confirm every fear I'd been trying to suppress. I brought the envelope inside, sat down at the kitchen table, and opened it.Photos.it first. My brain couldn't process what I was seeing. There was Rachel, clear as day, laughing and holding hands with our postman. Yeah, you read that right, the guy who delivers our mail every morning. The same guy I waved to while grabbing the newspaper, the one who complimented my dog, the guy who smiled at me like everything was normal. In one of the photos, they were sitting at a park bench, sharing a coffee. In another, they were walking out of a motel, her arm looped through his like it was the most natural thing in the world. And then the one that really hit me, they were kissing. Not just a casual kiss, but the kind of kiss that screamed familiarity, intimacy. The kind of kiss she hadn't given me in months. My hands were shaking. I felt like the walls were closing in, the room spinning around me. How long had this been going on? Was it just the postman, or were there others? My mind was racing with 1,000 questions, none of which had comforting answers. I sat there for hours, staring at those photos, trying to make sense of it all. Every late night, every weekend trip, every weird excuse, it all clicked into place. The gut feeling I'd been ignoring for months wasn't paranoia. It was reality. When Rachel finally came home later that night, I was waiting for her, the photos spread out on the kitchen table like some kind of twisted exhibit. The second she saw them, her face went pale. But then, almost immediately, she recovered. Too quickly. Way too quickly. "Oh, this," she said, like I'd caught her leaving dirty dishes in the sink, not cheating on me. "It's not what it looks like, Tom. Not what it looks like." I felt the anger bubbling up, mixing with the heartbreak. But I didn't say anything. Not yet. I wanted to hear what kind of story she'd spin. Because the woman standing in front of me wasn't the Rachel I thought I knew. She wasn't even close. I stared at her, waiting for some kind of explanation, some admission, something that resembled honesty. But Rachel just stood there, arms crossed like she was the one who had been wronged. "It's not what it looks like," she repeated, her voice annoyingly calm that I couldn't believe what I was hearing. The photos were right there, hard evidence of her betrayal, and she was still trying to gaslight me. "Really?" I finally said, my voice colder than I expected. "Because it looks exactly like you've been sneaking around with the postman." Her eyes flicked to the photos on the table, and for a second, just a second, I saw a crack in her facade. But it was gone just as quickly as it appeared. She let out this exasperated sigh, like I was being dramatic for even bringing it up. "Tom, you're overreacting," she said, as if her words could magically erase the images burned into my brain. "It's not a big deal." Not a big deal? My head spun. Was I living in some alternate reality where cheating on your spouse wasn't a big deal? I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, my hands clenching into fists at my sides. "Not a big deal?" I echoed, my voice rising despite my best efforts to stay calm. "You've been sneaking around with the guy who delivers our mail, Rachel. How long has this been going on?" She rolled her eyes like I was some annoying coworker asking too many questions. "It's just been a few months," she said, waving her hand dismissively. "And it's not like it meant anything. A few months." I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. This wasn't some fleeting mistake. This was deliberate, ongoing, and worst of all, she didn't even care. "It didn't mean anything?" I repeated, my voice shaking now, not from anger but from the sheer weight of betrayal. "Then why the hell did you keep doing it?" She shrugged, as if the answer was obvious. "Because you've been so distant, Tom. Always working late, always stressed out. I needed someone who actually paid attention to me." There it was. The classic deflection. Somehow, in her twisted version of events, I was to blame for her cheating. Because I worked hard? Because I tried to provide for us, that's your excuse? I shot back. "I've been working hard to build a life for us, Rachel. To give us a future. And your response is to hook up with the postman because you're bored?" She scoffed, brushing past me like the conversation was over. "Whatever, Tom. You're just mad because you got caught off guard. You've been so checked out lately, I figured you wouldn't even notice." Checked out. The words echoed in my head, but they didn't stick. Because I hadn't been checked out, I'd been trying. I'd been the one holding this relationship together while she was out playing house with someone else. That I watched as she grabbed a glass of water from the sink, acting like this was just another Tuesday night. Like her betrayal wasn't shattering the very foundation of our marriage. "I want you out," I said suddenly, the words spilling out before I could even process them. She froze, turning to face me with a smirk. "Oh, come on, Tom. Don't be ridiculous." "I'm not being ridiculous," I snapped. "You've been lying to me for months, Rachel. I don't even know who you are anymore. So yeah, I want you out. Now." For a moment, I thought she'd argue. That she'd fight to stay, maybe even fake an apology. But instead, she just laughed. Laughed. Like this was all some big joke. "Fine," she said, setting down her glass. "But don't expect me to sit around feeling bad for you." I didn't respond. I was done. Done listening to her lies, done trying to understand how the woman I loved had turned into a stranger. I grabbed her keys from the counter and tossed them toward the door. "You've got 10 minutes, I said quietly. "Then I'm locking the door behind you." She didn't say another word. She just grabbed her bag, scooped up her phone, and walked out the door without looking back. When the door finally clicked shut, the silence was deafening. I stood there, staring at the empty space where she'd been, feeling the weight of everything crash down on me. The anger, the betrayal, the heartbreak, it all hit at once, but underneath it all, there was something else, relief, because the lies were over. The pretending was over, and now, it was just me and the truth. The moment the door clicked shut behind Rachel, the reality of what had just happened settled in like a weight pressing down on my chest. I was alone. Not just physically, but emotionally, utterly alone in a house that suddenly felt too big, too quiet, and too full of memories I didn't want anymore. I sat down at the kitchen table, the same one where we'd shared countless dinners, where we'd laughed about stupid inside jokes, where we'd planned vacations and dreamed about the future. But now, that table felt like a crime scene, with those photos still spread out like evidence of everything I'd been too blind to see. I stared at them, my mind replaying every little moment that suddenly made sense. The late nights. The sudden interest in fitness, when she'd never cared about it before. The way she always seemed to be texting someone but never let me see her screen. It wasn't just the physical betrayal that hurt, it was the layers of lies, the way she'd looked me in the eye every day and pretended everything was fine. I tried to get up, to do something, anything, but my body felt heavy. Like my brain hadn't fully caught up to what my heart already knew. After what felt like hours, I finally moved. I gathered the photos, stuffed them back into the envelope, and tossed it into the drawer where we kept random junk batteries, takeout menus, old keys. It felt weird to just throw them away, like I needed them as proof that this nightmare was real. That it wasn't just some horrible dream I'd wake up from. The house was suffocating. Every room screamed Rachel. Her favorite blanket on the couch, her toothbrush in the bathroom, her perfume lingering in the bedroom. It was like she was still there, haunting me even after she was gone. I couldn't stay. I grabbed my jacket, my car keys, and left. I didn't know where I was going, I just knew I couldn't be there. Not right now. I ended up at the park a few blocks from our house, the same one where we used to walk on Sunday mornings, holding hands and talking about everything and nothing. I sat on a bench, staring at the empty playground, and let the cold night air wrap around me like a blanket. For the first time in a long time, I let myself feel everything: the anger, the betrayal, the heartbreak. It all came crashing down in waves, each one hitting harder than the last. How could she do this to me? How could the woman I loved, the one I trusted more than anyone, betray me like this? And with the postman, of all people? It wasn't just random, it felt personal. Like some twisted joke the universe was playing at my expense, but beneath all the anger, there was something else. Sadness. Deep, bone-crushing sadness. Because no matter how much I hated her in that moment, I also missed her. I missed the version of her I thought was real, the woman who made me laugh, who held me when I was down, who promised me forever. But that woman didn't exist. She was just a character in a story I'd been telling myself, and now that story was over. I sat there until the sun started to rise, painting the sky with soft pinks and oranges. It should have been beautiful, but all I felt was numb. When I finally went back home, the house felt different. Empty, but also free. I stood in the doorway for a long time, just taking it all in. And then, without thinking, I grabbed a trash bag and started packing up every trace of Rachel. Her clothes, her photos, the little knickknacks she'd collected from our trips. I didn't want reminders of her in my space anymore. By the time I was done, the house looked bare. But it also felt lighter, like I could finally breathe. I sat back down at that kitchen table, this time with a cup of coffee, and stared at the empty seat across from me. The pain was still there, but so was something else: determination, because Rachel might have shattered our marriage, but she didn't get to shatter me. The days that followed felt like a blur, each one bleeding into the next. It's strange how quickly life can shift from feeling stable to completely unrecognizable. One moment, I was married, building a future with someone I thought I knew. The next, I was waking up in a house that felt more like a stranger's than my own. I threw myself into work, trying to distract myself from the gaping hole Rachel had left behind. But no matter how many projects I buried myself in, the silence of coming home to an empty house was deafening. I'd walk through the door, half expecting to hear her voice, see her curled up on the couch, pretending like everything was fine. But all I got was silence and the echo of memories I didn't want. Friends started reaching out when they noticed I'd gone quiet. At first, I ignored them. I didn't want to explain what happened, didn't want to admit that the life I'd been bragging about was nothing more than a facade. But eventually, I gave in. One night, after too many sleepless hours, I texted my best friend, "Matt, you free to grab a drink?" He responded immediately, like he'd been waiting for me to finally reach out. We met at our usual spot, a little dive bar downtown where the lights were dim, and the bartender knew us by name. The moment I sat down, Matt didn't even ask. He just ordered 2 beers and waited, and that's when it all came out. I told him everything. The photos, the confrontation, Rachel's ridiculous excuses, and the gut-wrenching realization that the woman I loved had been lying to me for months. It felt like ripping off a band-aid that had been festering underneath, but with every word, I felt lighter. Matt just listened, his jaw tightening with every detail. When I finally finished, he shook his head, disbelief etched across his face. "Man, I don't even know what to say," he muttered, taking a long sip of his beer. "But you didn't deserve that. She's a complete idiot for throwing away what you had." Hearing someone else say it out loud hit differently. It wasn't just me feeling the betrayal now, it was real, validated, and undeniable. Over the next few weeks, I started to piece my life back together, one day at a time. I filed for divorce, a process that felt both surreal and liberating. Rachel didn't fight it. She signed the papers like it was just another task on her to-do list. No remorse. No apologies. Just signatures that I sold the house. There was no way I could keep living in a place that felt haunted by what we'd lost. I found a new apartment across town, smaller, simpler, but it felt like mine. No shared memories, no echoes of a broken marriage. Just a fresh start. I also cut ties with the postman. Obviously. I transferred our mail to a nearby post office, just to avoid the possibility of running into him. It felt petty, maybe, but I didn't care. I deserved that much. But even with all the changes, the healing wasn't linear. There were days when I felt like I was finally moving forward, and then there were days when the weight of it all pulled me back down. I'd see a couple holding hands on the street, and it would hit me like a punch to the gut. I'd hear a song we used to love, and suddenly I was back in that kitchen, staring at those photos all over again. But through it all, there was a quiet strength building inside me. I'd been shattered, yes, but I was also rebuilding. And each day, each step forward, was proof that I could survive this point. One night, as I sat on my new balcony, looking out over the city lights, I realized something important. Rachel may have broken my heart, but she didn't break me. It's funny how time doesn't stop when your world falls apart. The sun still rises, people still go to work, the world keeps spinning like nothing happened. But inside, you feel like everything's frozen, stuck in this weird limbo between what was and what's supposed to come next. That's where I was, caught in this strange, heavy fog of trying to figure out who I was without Rachel. Moving into the new apartment was a fresh start, but it didn't erase everything. The first night alone in that space hit me harder than I expected. I thought I'd feel liberated, like I could finally breathe without her presence weighing me down. But instead, it was just quiet. Not peaceful quiet, but the kind of quiet that echoes in your head, reminding you of everything you lost. The walls were bare, the furniture sparse, and the bed felt way too big for just me. I stared at the ceiling for hours that night, replaying every moment of our relationship, trying to pinpoint when it all started falling apart. Was it the late nights? The distant conversations? The way she'd stopped kissing me like she meant it? The more I thought about it, the more I realized the signs had been there all along. I just didn't want to see them, but wallowing wasn't going to fix anything. So, I made a decision: if I was going to move forward, I needed to start living for myself again. Not for Rachel, not for the idea of what our life could have been, but for me. I started small. I signed up for a gym membership not because I wanted to get back at Rachel or show her what she lost, but because I needed to feel strong again, both physically and mentally. Every drop of sweat felt like I was purging the anger and betrayal from my system. I pushed myself harder than I ever had before, and with each workout, the weight on my chest felt a little lighter. I also reconnected with friends I hadn't seen in years. Rachel had a way of making our social life revolve around her friends, her plans. Somewhere along the way, I lost touch with the people who knew me before I was part of a we. Matt was a constant, but there were others: old college buddies, co-workers I used to grab drinks with after hours, even my family, who I'd unintentionally distanced myself from because Rachel always found an excuse to avoid family gatherings. One Friday night, Matt dragged me out to a bar downtown. It wasn't our usual spot, but he insisted I needed a change of scenery. I wasn't thrilled about it. Socializing felt like climbing a mountain I wasn't ready for, but I went anyway. The place was packed, the kind of crowded that made it impossible to hear your own thoughts. But maybe that's what I needed. A night where the noise outside drowned out the noise inside my head. We found a spot near the bar, ordered drinks, and just existed. No heavy conversations, no rehashing the past, just two guys trying to remember what life was like before everything went to hell. That's when she walked in. I wasn't looking for anything or anyone, but there was something about her that caught my eye. She wasn't overly done up like most of the people in the bar. Just jeans, a simple top, and this effortless confidence that made her stand out in a room full of people trying too hard. Matt noticed me glancing her way and nudged me with his elbow. "Go talk to her." I shook my head, laughing. "Nah, I'm good." But he wasn't having it. "Come on, man. You've been hiding in that apartment for months. What's the worst that could happen?" The worst had already happened. But maybe that was the point. What did I have to lose? So, I did it. I walked over, heart pounding like I was back in high school. She was standing near the jukebox, scrolling through the song list with a drink in her hand. I tapped her lightly on the shoulder, and when she turned around, I almost forgot how to speak. "Hey," I managed, feeling more awkward than I had in years. "Any chance you're picking something that isn't terrible?" She laughed, a real, genuine laugh that didn't feel forced or fake. "I make no promises," she said, flashing me a grin. "But I'll take requests if you've got better taste." We started talking, and before I knew it, hours had passed. It wasn't flirty or forced. It was just easy. Her name was Emma. She was a photographer, recently moved to the city for work, and had this laid-back vibe that made it feel like we'd known each other forever. I didn't bring up Rachel, didn't mention the divorce, didn't dive into the mess that had been my life for the past year. For the first time in what felt like forever, I was just me, no baggage, no past, just present. When the night ended, she scribbled her number on a napkin and handed it to me. "In case you want to hear more questionable music choices," she said with a wink. I went home that night feeling something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope it wasn't about moving on or replacing Rachel. It wasn't even about Emma, really. It was about realizing that life wasn't over just because one chapter ended. There were still stories to write, still moments to experience, still people to meet who could remind me that not everyone was going to betray me. I didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, I was excited to find out. I stared at Emma's number for days before I finally worked up the nerve to text her. It wasn't that I wasn't interested, it was that I wasn't sure if I was ready. The thought of putting myself out there again felt like standing on the edge of a cliff, unsure if the ground beneath me would hold or if I'd fall flat on my face. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized something. I didn't need to have everything figured out to take a chance. So, I sent a simple text, "Hey, it's Tom from the bar. I promise I've got better taste in music than you. Want to test that theory over coffee?" She replied almost instantly, "Only if you're prepared to be proven wrong." Saturday at 10? That Saturday, I met her at a little cafe downtown, the kind of place with mismatched furniture and chalkboard menus. I expected it to feel awkward, like a first date after a breakup usually does, but with Emma, it didn't. We talked for hours about everything and nothing. She told me about her photography projects, her travels, and her love for capturing the small, unnoticed details of life. I found myself opening up more than I expected, sharing pieces of my story without diving into the heavy stuff. There was no pressure, no expectations. Just two people enjoying each other's company. It felt natural, like breathing after holding my breath for too long. As the weeks went by, Emma and I continued to see each other. It wasn't some whirlwind romance that swept me off my feet. It was slow, steady, and real. She became a constant in my life, not because I needed her to fill a void, but because I genuinely enjoyed being around her. She made me laugh, challenged me, and reminded me that not all relationships were doomed to end in betrayal. But even as things with Emma were going well, the shadows of my past lingered. There were moments when I'd catch myself pulling back, afraid to get too close, too invested. The fear of being hurt again was like a scar that hadn't fully healed. But Emma noticed. She never pushed, never demanded more than I was ready to give. She just understood. One evening, after a quiet dinner at her place, we were sitting on her balcony, watching the city lights flicker against the night sky. The air was cool, and the silence between us felt comfortable, not heavy. "You know," Emma said softly, breaking the silence, "you don't have to carry it all by yourself." I glanced at her, surprised by the sudden shift in conversation. "Carry what?" She gave me a look, the kind that sees right through you. "Whatever it is you're still holding on to. You don't have to tell me if you're not ready. But you don't have to shoulder it alone." Her words hit me harder than I expected. I'd been so focused on moving forward, on proving to myself that I was over Rachel, that I hadn't really dealt with the weight of what happened. I thought burying it would make it disappear, but all it did was leave it simmering beneath the surface. So, I told her. Everything. About Rachel, the affair, the photos, the confrontation. I laid it all out, expecting to feel exposed, vulnerable. But instead, I felt free. Like speaking it out loud finally loosened the grip it had on me. When I finished, Emma didn't say anything right away. She just reached over, took my hand in hers, and gave it a gentle squeeze. "I'm sorry you went through that," she said quietly. "But I'm glad you're here now." That was the thing about Emma. She didn't see me as broken. She saw me as someone who'd been through hell and came out stronger on the other side. And in that moment, I realized I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was living. Really living. But life had one more twist in store for me. A few weeks later, as I was grabbing my mail from the new post office, because yes, I still refused to risk running into our old postman, I saw an envelope addressed in familiar handwriting. It was from Rachel. For a moment, I considered tossing it in the trash without even opening it. But curiosity got the better of me. I opened the envelope right there in the parking lot. "Tom, I know I'm probably the last person you want to hear from, and I don't blame you. I just wanted to say I'm sorry. For everything. I handled things terribly, and I regret the way I hurt you. I don't expect forgiveness, but I needed you to know I've been thinking about what I did and how much I messed up. I hope you're doing well, Rachel." I stood there, reading and rereading the letter, waiting for the anger to bubble up, for the bitterness to return, but it didn't. There was no anger. No sadness. Just indifference. Rachel's apology didn't matter anymore. I didn't need it. Because I'd moved on, not just from her, but from the pain she caused. I folded the letter, tucked it back in the envelope, and tossed it into the nearest trash can. When I got home that evening, Emma was there, flipping through one of her photography books, her hair pulled up in a messy bun. She looked up when I walked in, and without saying a word, she knew something had shifted. "You good?" she asked, her eyes soft but curious. I nodded, a genuine smile spreading across my face. "Yeah. I'm really good." And I was. Because the past no longer had a hold on me. I wasn't defined by Rachel's betrayal or the pain it caused. I was defined by how I picked up the pieces, by the life I was building now, by the people who chose to be part of my story not because they had to, but because they wanted to. And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't just hopeful about the future, that I was excited for it. Life has a funny way of moving forward when you least expect it. One day you're drowning in heartbreak, convinced you'll never find your footing again, and the next, you're standing on solid ground, wondering how you ever doubted yourself. That's where I was standing in a life I had rebuilt from the ashes of betrayal, realizing that the worst thing that ever happened to me had somehow led to the best version of myself. Things with Emma had settled into this beautiful rhythm. It wasn't perfect, but that's what made it real. We spent weekends exploring the city, finding hidden coffee shops and quirky bookstores. She'd drag me to art galleries, and I'd convince her to join me on spontaneous road trips. We were different in so many ways, but somehow, we fit together perfectly. One night, after an evening of wine and laughter on her balcony, she turned to me with a thoughtful look in her eyes. "Do you ever think about what your life would have been like if none of that had happened with Rachel?" she asked gently. I thought about it for a moment. There was a time when I couldn't stop thinking about it, when the what-ifs haunted me more than the actual betrayal. But now? Now it felt like looking at a chapter from someone else's story. I used to, I admitted. But not anymore. I don't regret what happened because it brought me here. It showed me who I really am. Emma smiled, reaching over to intertwine her fingers with mine. "You're stronger than you give yourself credit for, you know." And maybe she was right. Because the man sitting there with her wasn't the same man who had once been blindsided by a betrayal he never saw coming. I was stronger. Wiser. More in tune with what I deserved. But life wasn't done throwing curveballs. A few weeks later, while grabbing coffee before work, I saw him. The postman. The guy who unknowingly, or maybe knowingly, blew up my marriage. He was standing in line, just a few feet ahead of me, like it was any other day. My heart raced, not from fear or anger, but from this strange mix of emotions I couldn't quite place. Here he was, the man who'd played a part in one of the worst chapters of my life, and yet, I felt, nothing. That he turned, his eyes meeting mine for a split second. There was a flicker of recognition, a flash of something that looked like guilt, but he quickly looked away, pretending not to see me. For a moment, I considered confronting him. Not to yell or fight, but just to say something, anything. But as I stood there, I realized I didn't need to. He wasn't worth my energy, my time, or my words. The power he once held over me was gone, reduced to nothing more than a footnote in my story. I paid for my coffee and walked out, leaving him and everything he represented behind. Later that night, I told Emma about the encounter. She listened quietly, her hand resting on mine as I spoke. "How do you feel about it?" she asked when I finished. I thought about it, really thought about it. And then I smiled, free. Because that's what it was. I was finally free from the weight of the past, from the anger and betrayal that had once consumed me. I wasn't just surviving anymore, I was thriving. And the people who had hurt me? They were stuck in the past, while I was living fully in the present. A few months later, Emma and I took a trip to the coast. It was one of those spontaneous decisions, the kind where you pack a bag, hop in the car, and just drive with no real plan in mind. We ended up in this small, sleepy town by the ocean, renting a little cabin with a view of the waves crashing against the cliffs. One evening, as we watched the sun dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Emma turned to me with a mischievous glint in her eye. "So," she said, nudging me playfully. "What's next for us?" I laughed, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "Whatever we want it to be." And I meant it. For the first time in a long time, the future wasn't something I feared, it was something I was excited to create. Not just with Emma, but with the person I'd become through it all, because at the end of the day, life isn't about the people who betray you. It's about the people who show up when everything falls apart and the strength you find within yourself to build something even better. A year had passed since Rachel's betrayal detonated my life, but as I sat on the balcony of our little cabin by the coast, I realized something I never thought possible. I wasn't angry anymore. Not at Rachel. Not at the postman. Not even at myself. The storm had passed, and I was standing in the calm, stronger than I'd ever been. Emma and I had spent the past few days in this sleepy coastal town, renting a small cabin that overlooked the ocean. It wasn't fancy or extravagant, but it felt like home in a way I hadn't felt since long before Rachel shattered our marriage. The salty breeze, the sound of waves crashing against the rocks, and the quiet moments with Emma were exactly what I didn't know I needed. One evening, after a day of hiking along the cliffs, we sat on the beach, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The sky was ablaze with oranges and pinks, and the water reflected it all like a mirror. It was the kind of scene you'd expect to see on a postcard, but living in it felt surreal. Emma nudged me gently, breaking the comfortable silence. "Do you ever think about it?" she asked, her voice soft but curious. I knew what she meant. She didn't have to say it. Rachel. The affair. The chaos that followed. I stared out at the horizon, letting her question hang in the air for a moment before answering. I admitted. I used to replay it all in my head, trying to figure out what I missed, what I could have done differently. But now? It feels like a different life. Like it happened to someone else. Emma squeezed my hand, her eyes searching mine. "I'm glad you're not stuck in that place anymore." And I was too. Because for the first time, I wasn't defined by what happened to me. I wasn't the guy who got cheated on. I was just me, someone who had been through hell and came out the other side better for it. But life, as always, had one more surprise in store. The next morning, we decided to grab breakfast at a small diner in town. It was one of those old-school places with vinyl booths and faded photos of fishing boats on the walls. The kind of spot where everyone knew each other and the waitress called you honey, no matter who you were. We were halfway through our pancakes when the bell above the door jingled, and in walked Rachel. I nearly choked on my coffee. Of all the places, of all the diners in all the towns, she had to walk into this one. She didn't see me at first. She was with a guy I didn't recognize, tall, clean-cut, the opposite of the postman. They laughed as they slid into a booth near the window, oblivious to the fact that she was sitting just a few feet away from her ex-husband. My heart pounded, but not from anger. It was this strange mix of disbelief and curiosity. I hadn't seen Rachel since the divorce was finalized. We hadn't spoken since that letter she sent, the one I never responded to. And now, here she was, living her life like I was just another chapter she'd closed. Emma must have noticed the shift in my energy because she leaned in, her voice low and steady. "Is that her?" I nodded, my eyes still on Rachel. "Yeah. That's her." Emma didn't say anything more. She didn't need to. She just placed her hand over mine, grounding me in the present, reminding me that whatever was sitting a few feet away from us didn't matter. But here's the thing, I thought I'd feel something. Anger. Sadness. Bitterness. But instead, all I felt was indifference. She was just another person in a crowded diner, her presence no more significant than the old man reading the newspaper at the counter. We finished our breakfast, paid the bill, and walked out without so much as a glance back. Later that evening, as we sat on the balcony, the sound of the ocean filling the space between us, Emma broke the silence. "You okay?" I nodded, a genuine smile tugging at the corners of my mouth. "Yeah. I'm more than okay." And I meant it. Seeing Rachel didn't reopen old wounds. It didn't bring back the pain or the betrayal. It just confirmed what I already knew. I was over it. Completely. She was a part of my past, a chapter in my story, but that's all she was. A chapter. And I'd moved on to better things, better people, and a better version of myself. Emma leaned her head on my shoulder, and we sat there, watching the stars appear one by one in the night sky. I realized then that life isn't about the people who hurt you. It's about the people who show up when everything falls apart and stay when you start putting the pieces back together. And as the waves crashed against the shore below, I knew one thing for sure: I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was thriving. And no betrayal, no heartbreak, could ever take that away from me.